We're going to be starting off this morning in Judges chapter 6. I don't have anything for the screens. We're going to be sticking kind of between the next couple chapters, so I may have you flip a couple pages here and there, but it'll all be right there together. This past week, the topic of Gideon came up. Somebody said that they didn't know the story of Gideon very well. And as I was thinking about that, I thought, it's one of those stories that we recognize it when we hear it, but if we haven't heard it for a while, sometimes we forget it. We always remember the fleece, the story of the fleece with him, but do we really remember what all happened? And in the book of Judges, we see Israel go back and forth so many times in their faithfulness and their turning away from the Lord, and he would raise up a new judge to lead the people. God would raise up a new judge like Gideon, for example, to lead the people, and he would lead them back into a good place with God, and then it would be like the cycle would happen all over again. They would turn from him and start worshiping false gods, false idols, and they would become unfaithful. Things would go poorly for the nation. They'd cry out to God, and he would send them a new judge to help them, and it's kept happening over and over and over throughout history. And we see the stories of the judges, but Gideon may actually be the longest story. It covers a few chapters here, so it's sometimes it's frustrating when I'm preaching on Gideon because there's so much that I want to include that it almost needs to be a series for me to fit everything in. So I'm not going to be going through every detail of it, but there's some key points that I want us to look at today, and some lessons I want us to learn from his story. And let's start off in Judges chapter 6, beginning at verse 1. Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian for 7 years. And the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel because of the Midianites. The children of Israel made for themselves dens, the caves, and the strongholds which are in the mountains. And so it was that whenever Israel had sown, whenever they got out to plant, the Midianites would come up, and also the Amalekites and the people of the east would come against them. They would encamp against them and destroy the produce of the earth as far as Gaza and leave no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep nor ox nor donkey. They would come up with their livestock and their tents, coming in as numerous as locusts. Both they and their camels were without number, and they would enter the land to destroy it. So Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites. And the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. This was just to recap some things that we know from the story of Gideon, because I'm not going to be able to hit them all throughout the sermon, but we know that Israel was facing this massive enemy in the Midianites. And the more we look into these things, the more we understand the backgrounds of where a lot of these things happened, where some of Israel's greatest enemies came from. And a lot of times their greatest enemies came from their own sins, their own mistakes. God told Abraham to have a child with his wife, and he had a child with her servant instead because they didn't trust that it would work out with her being able to at her age. And we have the son Ishmael before Isaac. So what happened because of his unfaithfulness? We've got Isaac and Ishmael who turn into Israel and Islam. We have the story of Jacob and Esau, where Jacob, who's renamed Israel, who becomes the father of Israel, is the father of the 12 sons who were the tribes of Israel, stole the birthright basically of his brother. I mean, he traded a bowl of stew for it, but he ripped him off. And his descendants, Esau's descendants, went on to be the Edomites. And look at how many problems Israel had with them, between Israel, the Israelites, and the Edomites. I mean, that's where they got people like Herod from. And there's so many instances where the actions of an individual affected so many people beyond themselves, affected the nation for centuries. And I think sometimes we don't realize just how great our own actions can impact the people around us. How many times do people make a decision saying, it doesn't matter, I'm not hurting anybody but myself, this is all just, who's it going to affect but me? And then, even if indirectly, it has an impact on the lives of the people around them. Maybe it's a situation where you end up in prison. Maybe it's a situation where your family is broken. Maybe it's a situation where you're hurting the people around you by them seeing what you're bringing into your life. It had great impacts, and these Midianites that they were facing here were rooted in. They basically stemmed from Abraham, who had a son with his concubine, which is just a fancy word for mistress. The woman who was not his wife but lived with him as his wife. He had a son with this concubine named Keturah, and their son was Midian, and these Midianites were his descendants. And they were these powerful enemies coming against them. And Israel had so many enemies in the area. If you read on before this, earlier in Judges and through Joshua, God gave instruction on what they were to do as they took the land. And they weren't supposed to leave behind any of these prior culture, the Canaanites and all these tribes who had these false idols that they were worshiping, these false gods, these Baal and Ashtoreth and all of these false gods. And they didn't listen. They left remnants of them there. And what ended up happening was, more often than not, Israel would start taking on their customs. Israel will start taking on their worship. And how often do we see it happen where we want to help somebody in a bad habit or a bad situation they're in, and instead we start picking something up from them. And that's what was happening here. They had, well, how does it start off? And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian for 7 years. Over and over and over we see, especially throughout the book of Judges, the way Israel turned away from God and things would go bad. And then they'd cry out to God and he would come and rescue them. And that's just the perfect picture of how we are with God. I can't tell you how many times I have turned against God and made horrible decisions and had horrible consequences from it, and then turned around and cried out to him and he would help me out. And then I turn around and lose sight of that again. It's sometimes it's hard to not lose sight of things that matter most. It says the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian for 7 years, and the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel. Read through the book of Judges sometime and count how many times you see those words that say, then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. It happens over and over and over. So God came to Gideon. They were in this famine. Gideon was hiding in a wine press to try to thresh some wheat. Usually they would do that in a special room where the wind could kick up and blow out all the junk that you don't want in the wheat so you can make some food from it. But he couldn't do that because of the risk of these Midianites. They were destroying their crops. They were taking or killing their animals. So he's hiding inside of this, I'm assuming like a vat, this wine press. I don't know how he's separated. Maybe he's tossing it up and seeing what the wind blows away, but he's hiding. And the angel of the Lord comes to him and tells him that the Lord is with him. First off, when you're in a position like this where for 7 years you've been tormented and things are going horribly and somebody says the Lord is with you, you might not feel like it. Sometimes it's hard to recognize that God is with us when we're going through something like that. But God raises him up as this mighty warrior. And we know the story that he has doubts. He has doubts because he's from the smallest tribe, and he's the smallest person in that smallest tribe of all of Israel. And he's like, who am I that I can do anything like this? And God proved his power through the work he did through Gideon. In chapter 6, I want to go down and read verses 25 through 27. The people needed help, and if they were going to get help, they needed to follow God's instruction. And God was raising Gideon up to be that man to lead them, and he had certain steps he needed to take. Verse 25, now it came to pass the same night that the Lord said to him, take your father's young bull, the second bull of 7 years old, and tear down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the wooden image that is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord your God on top of this rock in the proper arrangement. And take the second bull, and offer a burnt sacrifice with the wood of the image, which you shall cut down. So Gideon took 10 men from among his servants, and did as the Lord said to him. But because he feared his father's household and the men of the city, too much to do it by day, he did it by night. Step one was tearing down the altars. Their greatest sin throughout this time was worshiping false gods, worshiping these idols that were nothing, completely turning from God. His first task is to tear down his father's altar to Baal, and this image next to it was likely an Asherah pole. We know that there was the two false gods that many of the people like the Canaanites would worship, of Baal and Asherah. Some say that Asherah was his Baal's concubine, like his wife. Some people believe that Asherah was his mother. Doesn't really matter because they're not real anyways, but they worship them, and a lot of times they worship them together. And Gideon is understanding of how people are going to react. He knows that this needs to be done. I need to tear down these altars that are steering the people. It's his father's house. This is his own family who's turned against God so greatly. But people are so enamored with the worship of these false gods that he's afraid to tear it down he's going to do it, but he's afraid to do it and be known, because he's afraid for his own safety and how they're going to react to that. And that's a good illustration of how hard it can be sometimes to serve God in such an ungodly world, or to speak up for God in a place where so many people are against him. But they do it at night. And the next day, the men of this town, is Ophrah. It's not Oprah. It looks like Oprah. It's Ophrah. The men of this town, they confront Gideon. They're like, who tore these down? We want to know. And they realized it was him, and they confront him, and they want to take his life. They want to kill him for tearing down these idols that they love so much. And surprisingly, his father stuck up for him. Maybe not surprisingly because it's his father, but it was his father's objects of worship that were destroyed. And what was interesting to me was not only did God want him to destroy these things and tear them down, he wanted those things that he tore down, those false altars, to be the fuel for the fire, for the sacrifice to God himself. So Joash, who is Gideon's father, he sticks up for his son, and he says, if Baal is real, why are we? Basically, he says, why are we contending for him? Why are we sticking up for him? If this is a God, we don't need to protect him. We don't need to do his work for him. And so, because of all of this, they gave Gideon the nickname Jerubbaal, which means let Baal contend. Basically means let Baal handle his own affairs. Let him handle himself. Step one was tearing down ungodly altars. And now, we may not have a physical altar built up. We may not have something like this altar built in our house, or an Asherah pole, or wooden idols. But we build altars to things in different ways. Maybe it's within our hearts. Maybe it's in the things that we cherish. We need to identify the things in our lives that are straying our worship from God, the things that are pulling our hearts from him, the things that are maybe causing us to act against him. How can we identify them? How can we start tearing down those things in our lives? And tearing down these altars, it was step one of the tasks that God had given Gideon, but he had just taken a step of his own. Look at verse right before that, verse 24 says, so Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and called it, the Lord is peace. To this day it is still in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. Before he tore down those false altars, he had to build an altar to God himself. And that is so important to realize that we are never going to purge ungodliness from our lives without God. We are never going to clean up the things that we want cleaned up in our lives. We're never going to change our hearts toward God apart from God's presence. It's so often we want to, it's like cleaning up your house before the housekeeper comes. It's redundant and it's not effective. We're never going to be able to change our hearts the way He can without first welcoming God into our lives, without knowing God, without turning to Christ in faith. And if we start seeking God and we start worshiping God, He's going to reveal the things in our lives that we maybe shouldn't be worshiping, maybe that we don't even realize we're worshiping. And if we're willing to listen, we can start tearing down those idols, but it's got to be by God's strength, not by our own. So the first most important step was worshiping God and tearing down those idols. I want to read, let's cut down to verse 36. I'll read verses 36 through 40. So Gideon said to God, "You will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. Look, I shall put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said." And it was so. When he rose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece together, he wrung out the dew from the fleece, a bowl full of water. And Gideon said to God, "Do not be angry with me, but let me speak just once more. Let me test, I pray, just once more with the fleece. Let it now be dry only on the fleece, but on all the ground let there be dew." And so God did so that night, and it was dry on the fleece only, but there was dew all on the ground. He was testing God. It's like, God, if we're really going to do this, this is some big stuff that you're wanting to do through me. I need to know that it's really you. I need to know that you're for real. I need some kind of proof. And maybe deep down he knew that God was really going to do all these things, but he was stalling. I don't know. Sometimes when God calls us to something, we're like, are you sure? Maybe I better pray about this for a while. When deep down we already know the answer to it. But God knows how we are, and he knows how Gideon was. And like a lot of us today, Gideon was a man of inconsistent faith. I mean, how often do we have these awesome moments with God and working in our lives, uplifting moments in our walk with God? How often does he do something amazing that just builds our faith in great ways? And how often do we do God's will even when it's the hardest? And then turn right around and start doubting him again. The next time something crazy comes along, the next time something scary comes along, it's like we forget the amazing things that he has done. And Gideon had just torn down these false idols. This is a massive, we don't have a lot of people in our community that we see with, altars and idols out in their yard for worship. We don't really maybe understand the scope of how important these were and how big of a symbolic gesture this was. This was something powerful. He tore down these false idols. He faced death. And then he turns around and says, "God, are you sure? Like, buddy, you might have wanted to be sure about that before you put your life at risk." And even earlier before this, we see in, I think it's verse 21, he had just torn down these false idols and faced death for it. And earlier in this passage, the angel of the Lord proved himself one other time by bringing fire out of a rock to consume an offering, a sacrifice that he provided. And now Gideon's like, "I want you to prove yourself to me again." So what does he do? He says, "Lord, if this is real, if you're really going to help me defeat the Israelites, help the Israelites defeat the Midianites, I want you to make it so this fleece is soaked in dew and the ground is dry. And then I want you, again, the next time, I want you to make it so the ground is soaked in dew and the fleece is dry." Because that should be impossible on a normal night, just to leave something out and it's not just as covered as the ground. But thankfully, God doesn't rebuke this request of further assurance. He understands our fears, he understands our doubts, and he wants to assure us. And So he concedes to it, and he fulfills this request that he has, and he goes on to show him, you don't need the numbers that you think you need. And if we look at the numbers, they're facing an army of 135,000 soldiers, and they start out with 32,000 troops among themselves, and God keeps trimming that down and down and down until there's only 300 of them. He uses some unique ways to have them narrow it down, but he reduces it down, and in doing so, we see God's power at work. It's one thing if a powerful army defeats another army. It's another thing if somebody who has the odds completely stacked against them comes out so victorious, and we see God's power acting in that. I mean, think about the odds here. 300 against 135,000. Now, do the math on that. That's 450 to 1. I mean, think back to maybe when you were younger. Maybe you had some friends that were pretty tough. Maybe think of you and like a group of friends, like the 4 toughest people you could possibly think of. And then go up against 1,800 people and see how well the 4 of you do. It's insane. Like somehow 450 to 1 sounds even more crazy than 135,000 to 300. But God showed his power. And he showed him time and time again that he was with him and that he was going to fulfill what he came to fulfill, and he was going to answer the cries of the people who were suffering. He even goes on to assure him, they go on a little secret recon mission to spy on the enemy camp, Gideon and his servant, and they overhear one of their men talking about a dream about the imminent victory of Israel. And in response to this, he worships the Lord because he is encouraged by it. So he needed to tear down the altars, and then he needed to eliminate doubt. And now that the doubt was eliminated, he needed to trust in the Father's fight. It's just like every other battle we see in Scripture, God shows up in a mighty way that would have never been expected. How many battles have we seen won in strange seeming ways that God acted in? Like Jericho, that would have never, ever had the same outcome apart from God's intervention in it. So God divided the people into 3 separate companies, and Gideon, his army stations itself right outside the Midianite camp. And at his signal, every man blew a trumpet made from an animal's horn, and they smashed an empty jar and shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." And what happens is the enemy thinks they're outnumbered. It causes such a crazy chaos that it psychologically does something that they would have never expected. If you had a group of 300 people against an army of 135,000 people, I bet you could sit in a war room and strategize the best ways to go into battle, and not one person would come up with, "Hey, let's smash jars and yell stuff." Like, seriously, you would come up with anything but that. And once again, God proved that it was his power that did this, not their own. They needed to trust in his fight. So the men retreated. Gideon's men pursued. Some of the other tribes of Israel joined in with them. Others abandoned them. And something we see from this is that not every soldier was needed. They started off with 32,000 and whittled it down to less than 10% of that. With God's hand in it, they didn't need every soldier. But also not every ally showed up. And we can make so many plans in our lives on how we're going to conquer something, how we're going to face something. And if we seek God's hand in it, he's going to work it in ways that we would have never expected. But sometimes along the way, we've got to understand that not everybody that we expect to depend on is going to be dependable. And that's what happened with some of their own fellow tribes. they turned their backs on them. Maybe it was for fear, whatever it was for. But it didn't matter because God's hand was upon them. It was the Father's fight. It wasn't theirs. Just like marching around the walls of Jericho and blowing trumpets until the walls came down. So they needed to tear down altars. He had to eliminate doubt. He had to trust in the Father's fight. But something else that was so much more important was finishing well. How many times do we see people successful by God's hand throughout this period, and even in our own lives, that turn around and throw it away, or they make some devastating mistake? And unfortunately, the end of this story ends with Gideon taking the spoils of war. You know, he had all the men turn in the gold that they had golden earrings that they received from the enemy that they kind of plundered from their victory against them, and he takes it all and he forms it into a golden ephod. Now, what an ephod was, it was a garment that the priests would wear. So I don't know if he made this into something wearable. I don't know if he made this into something on a pedestal that looked like a statue shaped like an ephod. What exactly it was. But it backfired and the people started worshiping it. He may have had the greatest intentions in the world. He may have meant that as something that honored God. He may have thought, we took this from the enemy of God's people and we turned it into something that our priests wear. Maybe this will honor God. Maybe this is something that he'll appreciate. Maybe it'll be just a good memorial to what happened. But it backfired because the people once again turned against God. I mean, imagine if, let's say all of us were just totally loaded, like crazy rich. And I said, everybody give me a bunch of gold. We're going to honor God with it. Sorry, I'm just thinking about being rich for a second. We're going to honor God with it. And I melted it all down. And I made a giant golden cross for the front yard. So every time somebody drives by it, they're going to see that and worship God. And then everybody turns around and goes out and starts bowing down to that cross in the yard like it's some kind of an idol. And that's kind of what happened here. It ensnared the people. They were drawn to this object instead of the God who brought forth the ability to even have such an object. And it brought shame upon him. They've given this nickname, this Jerubbaal, for when he went up against Baal, and they changed his name to Jerubbesheth, which replaced the word Baal with shame, because he brought shame upon them with what he did. And after his death, they turn right back. They start being led by one of his sons, who was also born to one of the idol-worshiping women that he had with him. Let's go to lose my spot for a second here. Let's go to chapter 8 for a moment. Gideon didn't finish as well as he could have, but neither did the Israelites. Verse 33, so it was, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals and made Baal-berith their god. Thus the children of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all their enemies on every side, nor did they show kindness in the house of Jerubbaal, Gideon, in accordance with the good he had done for Israel. After everything they'd been through, the second he died, they turned right back to worshiping these false idols that led them into the position they were in the first place against these Midianites. We've got to finish well, even if it's just week to week. You know, we've all got different stories and lives and situations going on. We've all got things that nobody else knows about that we go throughout the week, things that we struggle with, or things that we fear, or things that problems we have, highs and lows, whatever they might be. But we finished that week here worshiping God together. He got us through that week. He'll get us through the next one. But if we're going to finish well, we need to remember where we came from. We need to remember the work that God has done to help us. You know, our lives before coming to know Him were spiritually in the same condition Israel was in when these Midianites came and oppressed them. How many of us have changed hearts? How many of us have lives that aren't maybe where we want them to be or where God wants them to be, but miles apart from where they used to be? And if we look back and remember where we started and what God helped us through, He's going to help us to finish well. But that all starts with turning our worship to God. Before He tore down the altars, He built one to God. And that has to start with us coming to Him. That has to start with us putting our faith and trust in Christ. That has to start with us confessing our sins to God. That has to start with us repenting and turning away from the things that hold us back from Him, from the things that He wants out of our lives, from these idols, from these altars. And if we trust in Him and remember where we came from, it's going to help us to finish well.